Nintendo wanted a new special looking game, and the main aim was to make something that was look special, because there was this big game coming out from Sega that was Disney's Aladdin.
Even today, Donkey Kong Country remains one of the most influential games of all time. With its unique approach to visual design and pivotal reimagining of a classic Nintendo character, it's no surprise that DKC stands as the third best-selling Super NES game of all time. But these days, with advances in graphics technology, it's easy to dismiss its pre-rendered graphics and simple gameplay as nothing more than a quaint artifact from another time. But if you dig deeper, there's much more to this game than you might first believe. On this episode of DF Retro then, we're diving back into the world of Rare circa 1994 for a look at this platforming classic, and this time, we're talking directly with some of the people that helped make it possible. What was it like working on a cutting-edge game from the early 90s?
I think the greatest challenge on Donkey Kong Country was initially believing that we could actually get it to work.
That's not all though. We're also looking at its stablemate, Killer Instinct. This arcade fighter pushes the techniques featured in Donkey Kong Country to the next level and remains an important piece of Rare history. All that and more is coming up on this special episode of DF Retro. Let's get started. To understand how Donkey Kong Country came to be, we need to first look back at Rare itself. Founded in 1982 by Chris and Tim Stamper under the name Ultimate Play the Game, the company made itself known on the ZX Spectrum with games such as Jetpack and Saberwolf. The ZX Spectrum was a popular machine in the UK and one beloved by many still today, but it was never much of a success outside of the UK. Ultimate needed to look elsewhere if it was going to grow its business, and that growth would come from Nintendo's Famicom. Said to be unbreakable at the time, the company got its hands on a Japanese Famicom system, reverse engineered it, and presented demos to Nintendo itself. Impressed with the results, Nintendo granted the company, which would now be named Rare Ltd., the license to produce games for its platform. Over the next 8 years or so, Rare would develop more than 60 games for Nintendo's machines, with various publishers handling the business side of things. Business progressed well for Rare, but a couple of years into the life of the Super NES, one very special computer would change everything.
At some point, Tim bought some magazines and some brochures in with details on this new technique of producing graphics. It was pretty much like a CAD design package, and after looking at some of the movies at the cinema at the time, I think there was films like The Abyss, and I think Terminator 2 had just come out. We were looking at trying to get these kind of effects into our games.
And the testbed for this new technology was none other than Battletoads, the arcade game.
And there was a spaceship that was moving along, and I modelled a very simple sort of spaceship in the shape of a toad that the three characters that were 2D sprites were sitting in, and I just got it to sort of rock like this, and I translated it from a lot of colours into very few colours just by using a few filters with the software that we'd got, and because it was moving, it actually did appear to look 3D. So I think I tried something else then, and it was some huge sort of steel balls like cannonballs that roll towards you at the end of the level. And I rendered those up in the same way, and because they were monochrome, you only needed sort of shades of grey to show that it was moving and coming towards you. So I rendered those and they worked okay.
In the end, the arcade version of Battletoads turned out great, with huge sprites, smooth animation, and solid brawler mechanics. And those initial experiments in SGI rendered visuals worked well, but this was just the beginning.
We started looking at modelling sprites for I think it was a fighting game that I was trying to work on at the time, and we knew that we could do it with 16 colours, so we thought maybe if we get 64 colours or a larger colour palette, they come out a little bit clearer. But then after working on it for a little while, Tim was doing some mock-up backgrounds for this fighting idea, and I did a couple of characters which were basically robots with a human head, because I thought they would be easy because they'd translate into fewer colours. And then he came and he said that Nintendo wanted a new special looking game. The main aim was to make something that was look special, because there was this big game coming out from Sega that was Disney's Aladdin, and it was featuring professional Disney animation, and so it looked amazing, and they wanted something that looked different to that, and they just coincidentally were working on this new technology.
Sega and Virgin Games were not shy with its promotion of its 16-bit take on Aladdin. Commercials were regularly aired, showcasing its beautifully animated visuals, and it would go on to become one of the best-selling Sega Genesis games of all time. The development team at Virgin pioneered a process known as Digicel, which compresses source artwork into a format that was usable by a 16-bit console. The development team, led by Dave Perry, would then go on to form Shiny Entertainment, which would release the equally impressive Earthworm Jim the following year. It just so happens that Rare was making progress on its own tests using SGI workstations, and the impressive results pushed Nintendo to invest in Rare. The closer relationship ultimately gave the Stamper brothers an opportunity to work with one of Nintendo's iconic characters of their choice.
Tim gave me a sheet which had a picture of the old Donkey Kong character designed by Shigeru Miyamoto, and he said that we were going to be doing something with this character, but we needed to turn it into a new style of the same character, but sort of updated. I did a few concept pictures along with a couple of other guys, and Tim chose the one that I did a little really sort of compact character because it was supposed to be for a platform game, and I was again thinking of how well is this going to translate into 3D, so I tried to keep it as simple as I could. And it's basically a Battletoad's head with a coconut on top of it because it's got the same eyes on DK.
The rendering being conducted on the Silicon graphics stations was clearly very impressive, but also not something the Super NES would be able to render in real time. The question was, how do you translate these detailed models into something workable in a Super NES game? It may seem trivial now, but at the time there were strict memory and color palette limitations in place, which made this far more challenging than you might think.
When we did the initial experiments, they looked interesting, but the limitation still, even with the SNES, was it had only 16 colours that you could use on any sprite. So we were having to condense something which had 16 million colours, which was pre-rendered on the Silicon graphics machines, down to 16 colours. And quite a few people believed, including me, said at the time, this can't be done, it's impossible. And just, it's like, we're never going to do it, it's just not feasible. But in the end, it works, because if you get down to those number of colours, the brain fills in the rest. And the size that these things are on screen, and the fact that you've got multiple frames of movement, it kind of all adds to the realism, and actually made it be way beyond what we could possibly have dreamed it would have been initially.
It wasn't long after this that Donkey Kong Country went into full development. Of course, it's one thing to create a few renders for demonstration purposes, but it's quite another to build all the necessary models and implement them. Donkey Kong Country includes a wide variety of stages and enemies. Aside from DK and Diddy, you have a large cast of enemies, smaller items like barrels and bananas, as well as the stages themselves. So what did it take to bring an object or character from the artist's imagination into the game itself?
Yeah, so the way it worked was you'd build like your character. The package then I think was called Power Animator. It was like the forerunner to Maya, and we would build, everything was done in NURBS, not polygons. It was incredibly slow and time consuming, and when you'd kind of build a character out and texture it, use a lot of procedural textures, which is something that's still used a lot today, especially on like the latest kind of texturing packages. And then you'd like create animations, and then you'd just basically render them out a frame at a time.
One of the big problems was that these frames just took ages to render out, because this was back in the 90s. You know, if you wanted to render something today, it's easily just click a button and it's there. But you know, rendering back then was just taking a long time, and we had powerful machines on a desktop, but they weren't powerful enough if you wanted to render 100 frames of an animation out. And so people would have to queue these up on different machines and then wait overnight. But that still wasn't long enough, so we saw that Silicon Graphics had this solution, which was a giant machine. It was like twice as wide as I am and way taller than I am. And this machine would just, it just took a massive amount of space, it made a lot of noise and generated a lot of heat. And it would just run constantly, and people would be throwing things at it all the time. But even that would still take overnight, and people would often do things like, you'd have artists who would be desperate to get their animation done for the next day, so they'd see that somebody else's animation was running. And I believe there's stories around where they would kill the process of somebody else if they thought that their work was more important than somebody else.
Creating and rendering the artwork was step one, but once this was completed, there was the matter of converting these renders into chunks which could be used within the game itself. To support this task, a special machine was created by one of the in-house tech guys with a special editor similar to Deluxe Paint, where the art would be manipulated to fit within the required constraints.
So what would happen is you'd render up a image which would be like 24-bit, millions of colors, and you'd import this onto the hardware, and you'd pick out 16 colors that would, and then you'd like kind of run the conversion on it and see what you thought. And if you didn't like it, go back and change your palette up a little bit. And so you'd end up with a palette of 16 colors, usually for a character. We'd have so many palettes reserved for background, so many palettes reserved for characters. So obviously that would limit the amount of characters on screen. You're also limited by the sprites, the amount of sprites you have on a horizontal line. So we used to have to go through with all these frames and put boxes on to like put them into sprites. And you know, you have to be careful of the overlap and stuff, and you have to try and get it down to as few sprites as possible, but keep the overlap down. And then you'd also have a palette reserved for more common stuff, so things like the barrels, the bananas, stuff that could come on at any time. They had to share a palette of like 16 colours, so that was, you know, that was one of the things I had to do, try and get all these common objects to fit into like this tiny little 16 colour palette.
While folks like Mark were working on objects, others such as Steve Hurst, whose first project was actually Donkey Kong Country 2, it should be noted, spent their time creating the building blocks used to build the stages.
So yeah, my job entailed, what I would do, I'd get a piece of artwork that had been done by the background artist, basically a 3D render of, say, a platform, and it was then my job to take that image, chop it down, reduce all the colours and create a tileable element that could be used in the game. So it was very, very difficult, because I mean the SNES had limited palettes and we were getting images back that were millions and millions of colours, so it was quite difficult.
Once all this artwork was converted into the appropriate formats and prepped for use in the game, it would then need to be implemented by one of the programmers.
So getting those files, so what would happen, all these files would be rendered. So one of the artists, say for example Steve, would render all these images, and then and going back previously when we were doing hand-drawn images, the limitation was simply the artist's time. So the artist would draw a few images and you put them in and you go, oh, I need another image here, I need an in-between between this one and that one because it doesn't quite look right. So the limitation was sheer artist time. It was kind of flipped the other way around this time, because with pre-rendered images, they can create as many frames of a sequence as they want. Once they created the animation, so Steve would generate hundreds of frames of a jump sequence, and I get this thing and I go, I can't put this in because it's got like, he would take 10 seconds to do this jump because he'd be going through there really smoothly. So what we'd do is we decide to chop out some of the frames in order to get that right. But we also had to chop them out because we had so many frames, we would just have too much memory to even fit the cartridge. I mean, the cartridge for DKC was large by large of its times anyway, but we would have way more than we needed frames. So we had to cut them down. So it was a weird to go from the point where you never had enough frames and you always felt you had to make do with the frames because of the development time. But now you had too many and you were just going, oh, I don't need these, just throw them out.
this is the end result. Each part of this process was slow, and at the time, there wasn't really any sort of reference to work from. Everything created in Donkey Kong Country had to be made from scratch without freely available reference material.
We didn't have the internet to research these things. Nowadays you go, well, how do you do this? And it tells you. Back then we just thought, well, how are we going to do it? I know, well, I'll just start coding here, you start writing stuff over there, and when you've done, bring me a floppy disk, put it in, and then well, I'll paste that code into my file, and then we'll just keep doing that every few days. And that was the way the game was developed. It was just a case of I would have the main body of the code, and then somebody else would work on the visual effects or some other feature, and then they'd bring those things in. So there was several of us working on the game, but that was the first time we'd done that at Rare.
At this point, with the game well underway, Rare shifted into high gear to prepare for its first showing.
And then we sort of spent, I don't know, a good month or so all hands on deck, just building all of these characters and bits of background to put together for the demo, which I think it was for the CES show. I didn't go to the CES, but there was a small group of people that went, and when they came back, they said it just blew everybody away. So
the response should come as no surprise then. After all, Rare was known for pushing the envelope well before Donkey Kong Country. In games like Battletoads on the NES, the programmers managed to implement things like parallax scrolling, while many of its other NES games presented visuals that were atypical for the machine. When talking about Donkey Kong Country though, the first thing that comes to mind for most people are its pre-rendered sprites. And as we've learned thus far, getting these to work in the first place was a huge technical hurdle. But there's a lot more to DKC than its SGI rendered characters. It's a game that uses the Super NES hardware in very smart ways, enabling cool effects that were not common on the platform. First, there's the parallax scrolling. The Super NES features multiple hardware scrolling layers which can be manipulated by the designer to create depth. This is very common on the system, but what is less common, however, is line scrolling. Look at the background here and you can see rows of trees scrolling independently of one another, but it's ultimately just using one hardware background layer. This is likely done using HDMA to modify graphics settings on a per scanline basis.
It was a case of Tim Stamper working with Brendan, who's the kind of visual effects guru who put a lot of these things together, and they were constantly challenging each other about what they could do and how they could, they're pushing each other to see what they could do next. So it was a case of, oh, can we get another layer of parallax? And some of them were just the different layers that the SNES allowed you to add in with this different images on different layers, and then you can move them at different rates. And then other things you can do because you've got a character map screen, you can do things where you can update certain other character maps and then give the illusion that there's another layer going on there. So you can have, say, snow or something that's actually individually changing some of the different characters and updating those at every frame, and then it gives the illusion that you've got even more layers of parallax. So there was a case of adding those on top of the layers that we already had to get a really vivid and strong depth.
While not necessarily uncommon on the Super NES, the implementation here is a step beyond most other games for the system, giving the impression of more richly detailed backgrounds. This extends to the color gradients as well, which are used to create more dramatic sunsets across the game. It can even shift its palette to create the illusion of a day-to-night cycle. Of course, Rare would go on to further enhance and refine its work in the sequels. The line trick used to give the impression of real depth seen in Donkey Kong Country 2 is perhaps one of the best examples of this. It still looks great today. Beyond that, DKC makes full use of the system's color palette and transparency features, from the subtle swinging lights in the mine stage to this flashlight holding bird, which features a transparent cone that can briefly flash the screen to simulate shining light in the player's eyes. It all looks very impressive. Taken together, it's fair to say that Donkey Kong Country simply makes great use of all the available hardware features, and it did it without the aid of any additional chips like the Super FX or even one of the DSPs. Even without the SGI rendered sprites, DKC would still stand as an impressive Super NES game. Then there's the audio. The music and sound programming are of exceptionally high quality. The soundtrack was composed primarily by David Wise and made tremendous use of the sample-based Super NES hardware. Rather than focusing on high-speed, high-energy tunes, Wise instead opted to focus on building atmospheric tracks like this. It's the kind of sound quality that simply wasn't possible in the competition, at least without a CD-ROM add-on. Donkey Kong Country features a fresh bank of sounds crafted specifically for the game, and it shows. Over time, the soundtrack has become extremely popular, but during development it wasn't even certain that Wise, who was still freelance at this point, would be working on the game. He assumed that Nintendo of Japan would compose for it since it was so important to them, yet his demo tracks were so good that he was offered a full-time position with Rare. Ultimately, over the course of 18 months, all this hard work would coalesce into a remarkably impressive whole. Nintendo had their special-looking game, and it released at just the perfect time. The Nintendo Ultra 64 was still a year or two out, and the Super NES was starting to look dated in comparison to the numerous next-generation machines arriving. DKC, though, completely redefined what people expected from the hardware, and Nintendo's marketing team was not afraid to lean into it. Yes, this was the Play It Loud era for Nintendo, and DKC was one of its most important games. There's no doubt about it, Donkey Kong Country was a phenomenon, a game which would help define the Super NES in its later years. For those of us that experienced the game near launch, the impact is difficult to understate. And to help illustrate the impact that the game had at the time, I want to welcome my friend Mark from My Life in Gaming to talk about the game.
I'll never forget how in the fall of 1994, my neighbor from across the street opened a catalog and said, "Have you heard of this Donkey Kong Country game? It has so many graphics." My first thought was, I'm pretty sure graphics aren't quantified that way. And my second was, 8 bits just aren't enough for me anymore. Since I only had an NES and Game Boy at the time, my DKC experience may have been a bit different from those who'd been in the 16-bit trenches for the past 3 to 5 years. But on Christmas Day, I suddenly found myself with a new console and a range of titles highlighting the Super Nintendo's technical evolution, including its latest and most groundbreaking showcase. It seems to be that there's a common sentiment that, oh, the Donkey Kong Country games were just about the graphics. And sure, I was blown away by the jungle sunsets, indoor-inspired treetops, and raging snowstorms, and I still am. You cannot convince me that this piranha fish looks any less real today than it did back then. And it's amazing to consider how well the character animation has held up when the technique was so experimental and the cartridge size is so limiting. But even still, my intense love for the Super Nintendo Donkey Kong Country trilogy has always been rooted in the gameplay. While DKC was sold as a technically advanced game, it really goes back to the platformer basics. Most of the complexity that the genre had built up over the years was thrown out, and the core mechanics were pared down to pretty much just running, jumping, and rolling. This is platforming in its purest form, perhaps even more so than Mario or Sonic. But Rare refined those basics into something that just feels so right. Great play control, as we called it back then. Sometimes there are criticisms that Donkey Kong Country, especially the second and third games, relies too much on level gimmicks, but I love how these varied concepts work seamlessly with the series' established base mechanics, and few 90s platformers can claim that every level is quite so distinct with its own concepts and themes. The original DKC was the first game that made me think critically about what is good level design. There's a beautiful, almost mathematical flow to every level. If you encounter one bee, then later you'll probably have to dodge 2 and then 3. If you're feeling confident and keep holding right as you make a big roll or jump, chances are you'll land right where you can bop a whole string of enemies. Once you get a handle on a level's flow, it's almost zen-like. This feeling that you can sense what is ahead, and when you nail the right moves before you even see it coming, it's the most incredible feeling. I mean, sure, it's often just rows of bananas and other design tricks meant to nudge you toward finding a secret or pulling off a cool move, but regardless, it's like platforming that makes you feel like you have the force. Now that's good level design. I'm sure that's the way that a lot of people might feel about Sonic, but for me, it's Donkey Kong Country.
With a smash hit on its hands, Rare wasted no time in building on its momentum. 2 sequels would be developed for the Super NES, each offering a unique take on the formula. The second game boasts improved visuals, more complex level design, and one of the best soundtracks to grace the system. Most of the original development team would then move on to other projects including Project Dream, but some would stay behind to work on a third game. All told, these 3 games would go on to sell millions of units and remain some of the most beloved on the system. But there was a lot more to Donkey Kong Country than just the Super NES. Seemingly against all odds, teams within Rare worked to bring the series to Nintendo's portable systems. The first is Donkey Kong Land for the original black and white Game Boy, which was an original game inspired by Donkey Kong Country. What's impressive about this release is just how much of the original vision is still present in this 8-bit handheld iteration. It really pushes the Game Boy in ways that many other titles in the system did not. If you go back to Nintendo's own efforts like the original Wario Land, levels were built entirely from square tiles with 90-degree angles, which limited the complexity of the stages. Things like coins were entirely static as well, just floating in the air rather than spinning as they did in the console games. Donkey Kong Land, however, pushes beyond this, offering stages full of slopes along with spinning banana sprites. This of course requires more storage space on the cartridge and more efficient use of said space. While the game is well made, the art style doesn't really work that well with the limited palette of the Game Boy, and it's more difficult to visually read what's happening compared to many other titles in the system. It also uses rather large sprites, which reduces the size of the playfield, making the platforming more challenging since you can't always see what's coming up. Still, it's a neat little game and would receive multiple black and white sequels over the years, but what's interesting about these games is how they were developed. Completely separate teams were formed, and they used some rather unexpected tools to make the game.
We completely started from scratch. It was a different team. I actually worked on the last black and white game, so I did all the level design on that. We were using a Silicon graphics machine for the level editor. It's like mental, but so yeah, it was a spare one. It's like, oh, we'll do it on that. And so someone wrote a level editor for it, and we were using that to create the levels.
It's also worth mentioning that Japan received an exclusive version of Donkey Kong Land 3. Known as Donkey Kong GB, Dinky Kong, and Dixie Kong, the Japanese version is actually a Game Boy Color game rather than a black and white Game Boy game. This release then would be the final Donkey Kong Land game released. Around the same time though, another very small team within Rare started experimenting on another piece of Nintendo hardware.
I was kind of drafted on to help a programmer just look at see what was possible on the Virtual Boy. So I ended up taking some of the sprites that had been done for the Game Boy version and putting them into the Virtual Boy.
If you couldn't guess, this was a very early project that never really made much progress, thus there's not really any official media available for it.
It would have taken a lot of work to get the game running, and also because the Virtual Boy was proving not to be the success that Nintendo maybe had hoped. It was an interesting project, but I don't think it ever really got off the ground beyond a few scrolling screens of graphics. It was essentially a 3D black and white, well, red and black version of DKC, yeah. Or I suppose you could compare it to the Game Boy version. It's similar to the Game Boy, but with full 3D. And the effect that we had was very, very good. We managed to get a very solid looking game, but the techniques that we needed to do it were very laborious, because normally when you do an image or a sprite, you just do it from front on, whereas we would have to render out 2 different things from either side to get the 3D effect. So it was quite. So instead of just rendering out 1 image, you'd render out 2 from different eyes, if you like.
With the Virtual Boy off the table, the rest of Rare, including the DKC3 team, moved on to other projects centered primarily around Nintendo's next generation Nintendo 64. Donkey Kong. Unfortunately, things didn't quite go as planned.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as we finished DKC3, we started on what was to become Donkey Kong 64. I mean, that was kind of 3 years from start to finish, but it had a bit of a reboot about halfway through. Originally, it was kind of trying to stay more faithful to the format of the country games, you know, kind of A to B levels, you know, and obviously we were new to 3D and stuff at the time, and it just started to become apparent how, you'd spend weeks and weeks building a level and people would play it in like a few minutes and that would be it, it'd be done. And, you know, you started to realise, I guess a lot of games went the way of Mario 64, you know, where you have more of a sandbox thing and you have a bunch of big levels and a ton of different things you do in there. So that was kind of what happened to Donkey Kong as well.
And this is indeed the case. The final release of Donkey Kong 64 is a sprawling game focused on exploring huge open environments while completing various tasks along the way. The original concepts in comparison, however, seem to share more with the likes of Crash Bandicoot or Klonoa.
Yeah, it was kind of 2.5D. I think there was some bits that kind of went in the screen, some bits that kind of scrolled sideways. Kind of more of a fixed camera with no control over it. And yeah, I guess that's the best way to describe it.
Now, you might be wondering, just how long was this version of Donkey Kong 64 in development?
I mean, I think that was going for about 18 months. But you have to bear in mind that that was kind of started on the N64, which was new to the team. You know, back then we had no kind of common game engine. Everybody kind of did their own thing. So, you know, a lot of that early work would have literally just been getting stuff up and running anyway, from a kind of technical point of view.
The move from pre-rendered SGI sprites to real-time 3D was certainly profound. At this point, 3D graphics were still relatively new, and the team had a lot to learn in building this new game.
It's like a double-edged sword, really, because like visually, you can't get anywhere near the fidelity that you were getting from like pre-rendered graphics and stuff. But then the flip side of that is there's other advantages to being in 3D. So, you know, in 2D, you have like, it's kind of like classic cell shading. So you have a frame and a bunch of frames to do like a cycle of an animation. And you'll find that you run out of memory pretty quick, and the programmers end up taking out all your lovely frames. So the character's just going, but in 3D, it's like the opposite. You can do so much more with animation because it's all driven from like a joint system, and the animations can kind of blend into each other, and it's less data heavy than like the visual kind of side of animation. So the flip side was, although we couldn't get the visual fidelity and the visuals of the characters, we could be so much more expressive and do so much more with the animation side of it.
In the end, DK64 released to mostly positive reviews, but it wasn't perhaps everything fans had hoped for. The levels are massive and beautifully made for the system, but the game itself is bogged down by a focus on collectibles. If the original country games were stripped down to focus on precision platforming, DK64 went in the exact opposite direction. Overall then, it's an interesting but flawed experiment that's still worth checking out today if you're interested in the history of Kong. Not long after this, however, Rare returned to the Country series itself with the release of Donkey Kong Country for the Game Boy Color. This 8-bit machine was more capable than the original black and white system, and Rare took full advantage of its features, producing a surprisingly playable and attractive version of the game. Now, clearly you aren't going to get a one-to-one port of DKC on the Game Boy Color, but the team did a respectable job of translating the experience of the Super NES game to a much less powerful handheld system. When you compare the two side by side, it's obvious where the cuts were made, but still, it's recognizably DKC and it plays better than the previous black and white games. Keep in mind that the Game Boy Color supports just 3 colors plus alpha for sprites, which is a huge step down from the Super NES. Thus, assets needed to be recolored to fit within the constraints of the system. Music was also recreated for the Game Boy sound chip, and the results are surprisingly great. All told, DKC on Game Boy Color is a solid platformer for the system that manages to convey the feeling of the original game on a more limited piece of hardware. The following year, however, Nintendo would unleash its next-generation portable system, the Game Boy Advance. It wasn't long before Rare started working on bringing its Kong classics to the new machine, starting with the original Donkey Kong Country. The end result is an interesting port, but despite hardware much stronger than the Game Boy Color, it's immediately clear that it doesn't quite look like the original game.
The SNES was technically a better machine than the Game Boy Advance, and obviously we wanted to get the closest kind of variant of the game that we could at the time. So we had all the original artwork, obviously, and so basically we went through the process of trying to match the graphics on the Game Boy Advance that the SNES had. The biggest issues we had were the screen was kind of backlit on the Advance, so it made a lot of the graphics look really kind of washed out and different from the original SNES version. So I think that was probably, looking back at the reviews, that there's like people were kind of saying, "Oh, it doesn't look the same as the SNES," even though the resolution was slightly less as well, but they were the actual SNES graphics on the Game Boy Advance.
Clearly, the Game Boy Advance screen itself was a huge issue in developing the game. The original models featured a non-lit screen, which required developers to tailor artwork and the brightness of the game around this limitation. A couple years later, however, Nintendo released a side-lit version of the GBA known as the Game Boy Advance SP, which raises the question, with two very different models available, why not offer two display modes which take these systems into account?
You know, looking back at it, it's like it's one of these things that Nintendo's they're kind of, it's the same machine basically. It's like from the user's point of view it is, and you know, starting to put options in like that, it's not good for the user experience, I don't think.
When stacked up against the Super NES, the differences are even more profound. The primary background layer and the sprites are certainly derived from the Super NES, as Gary noted, but there are other changes afoot. The distant background layers, for instance, have been changed. The smooth gradients and line scrolling featured on Super NES are replaced with simplified layers instead. The second stage, set at night during a storm, sees even more dramatic changes, with most of those effects removed entirely. The cool palette shifting seen in many levels on Super NES has also been eliminated on the GBA. And when you land in the darker stages, it just winds up looking like this. On top of that, the resolution of the GBA screen is lower than the Super NES, with GBA featuring just 192 pixels of vertical screen real estate, while the Super NES uses 224. This results in a slightly cropped gameplay image. Clearly, most of this is the result of tailoring the artwork to function on a non-backlit screen. A dark and stormy level on a stock GBA would be nearly impossible to see. With that in mind then, the results here really aren't half bad. There are other unique changes as well. The game now begins with a full introduction sequence, which was missing from the original, while boss fights include post-victory exchanges with Cranky Kong himself. The world map is also redesigned for the GBA with actual scrolling and animation implemented this time. And on top of that, the music sounds surprisingly good. It's no secret that the GBA lacks dedicated sound hardware, but the team was able to craft something that sounds different yet familiar. Ultimately, DKC for the Game Boy Advance is an interesting iteration of the classic game, and the number of changes implemented here make it worth checking out on its own. And with Game Boy Advance out of the way,
Killer Instinct.
yes, it's time to jump back to 1994 prior to the release of Donkey Kong Country itself and look at Killer Instinct. This is an important and interesting game for its day, as it showcases the full potential of the pre-rendered SGI work Rare was doing at the time without the constraints of the Super NES hardware. When designing an arcade game, after all, the sky's the limit, and thus the team was unshackled to push new boundaries. Powered by a bespoke arcade board using a MIPS R4600 CPU, Killer Instinct is one of, if not the first arcade game to make use of a hard disk drive. And the reason for it? Why, the backgrounds, of course, the visual element which separates KI from any other game at the time.
If you point the camera on a traditional game, when you'd look at a 2D plane on front of the screen where you're playing, everything else would traditionally move behind, and it would move in a 2D fashion but a different speed to give the impression of depth. And so we would call that parallax scrolling, and so the further things were away from the camera, the slower they moved, and so they gave the impression that it was far away. But if we wanted to get this perspective, you'd have had to almost do it on every scan line to allow everything to sort of move in perspective as the camera moved. But as soon as we started rendering the backgrounds in Maya, we totally had a 3D environment because the camera was picking up with the depth of field and all the perspective. And so every time the camera moved, we noticed everything moved, and we could see behind this object and in front of this object, whereas what we were used to seeing for so many years was just something moving along like this on the same plane. And so when we first saw it and we rendered the camera, it was a bit of a mistake because we didn't really expect to see quite so much perspective. And when we moved it and we had a character on the foreground and this sort of animation sequence of a camera panning from left to right as the character moved, it was really apparent the depth that was there, and it was just, I think that's what took it to another level. There was no static billboard backgrounds moving like this. Everything was sort of moving as it would do in the real world. And
the question is, once you have all these 3D models, how do you display it within the game itself while keeping the frame rate at a smooth 60 frames per second necessary for a fighting game?
Every frame was, I think it was sort of 3 screens long, so it was 320 by 640 resolution, 320 by 240 resolution. So you'd have sort of 3 screens wide, maybe 2 screens wide, and the camera would start in the middle, and then we rendered every single frame, and I don't know whether it was like 50, 60 frames or something like that, all stored and compressed. And I think that was one of the stumbling points, was getting a good enough compression routine sorted to get everything onto the hardware. I think one of the guys spent a good couple of months trying to work out the best compression for that. So, but yeah, that was we couldn't not do that after we saw it. We were thinking maybe we'll just make the camera move just a little bit, or maybe we'll split it up and have layers. But as soon as we saw the effect, I think also we on the arcade hardware we did also have an arena level where you could be on the top of a roof, and so that was a very simple arena with clouds in the background. I didn't think that was going to work because the characters were actually just 2D sprites, but the camera rotated all the way around the level when it came in, and when you knocked a guy off the roof, it held up because it was just as if the characters were always facing the camera, but because they'd got so much solid rendering class to them, they looked like they weren't paper made, and they'd got a shadow, and so it all looked pretty good and it kept together.
Killer Instinct was a huge success in the arcade, but its unique visual style made for a challenging console conversion. KI would be released on multiple Nintendo consoles, with each version differing significantly from the arcade original. The Super NES port is a valiant effort then, applying techniques learned while making DKC. Backgrounds are reduced to flat two-dimensional images, while character sprites are drastically reduced in size with fewer animation frames. It looks pretty good for the Super NES, and is about what you'd expect given the massive gulf in hardware capabilities. What's impressive here though is how well it stacks up in terms of actual gameplay. It still plays very much like Killer Instinct, and in that sense, it's a very impressive port. And the next port is equally impressive, Killer Instinct for the Game Boy. To fully appreciate it though, we need to first look at other fighting games on the Game Boy at the time. Take Mortal Kombat 2. The sprites are large for Game Boy, but the frame rate is obscenely low, the background simplified, and the animation rather poor. It really doesn't look or play much like actual Mortal Kombat, does it? Killer Instinct though, not only does it run at a full 60 frames per second with more frames of character animation, Rare also implemented parallax scrolling across most of its backgrounds. The Game Boy doesn't natively support independently scrolling background layers, of course. Instead, the programmer simply modifies background scrolling on a per scanline basis. Of course, all the other Game Boy limitations apply as well, including the highly limited color palette, but still, the end results look pretty good. And then we come to the Nintendo 64 version. With its cartridge-based format, the pre-rendered backgrounds were off the table, but at least the hardware is much more powerful.
When we put the N64 version together, we knew that that was going to work, and I think by taking some of the elements of the arcade hardware and applying the textures to that arena, we were confident it was still going to look okay. Not exactly the same, but still had plenty of depth.
As Kevin suggests, the N64 version moves to fully 3D backgrounds across all its stages, with some base textures applied across the polygons based on the arcade version. The effect works well enough, but when compared to that arcade original, it's obviously nowhere near as detailed. It's not just the backgrounds either, the character sprites themselves also took a hit. The thing is, when Killer Instinct was first marketed in arcades, it, along with Cruisin' USA, boasted the Ultra 64 logo, suggesting that these arcade games were built using Nintendo's next-generation console, but really, the hardware was rather different.
Available for your home in 1995, only on Nintendo Ultra 64.
Now, the N64 does share a similar CPU, but the rest of the machine differs significantly. Still, given the constraints here, Rare did a good job bringing KI to the N64, and it plays pretty well. Following this, however, the series would remain dormant for years, before eventually returning in 2013 on Xbox One, created by a completely different studio. Through this new release, Killer Instinct lives on today. And with that, we've come to the end of another DF Retro. I hope you enjoyed this look back at one of Rare's most famous games and can appreciate Donkey Kong Country for what it is, even today. We're not done though. During the interview sessions, I also had the opportunity to discuss games beyond the Super NES era, which means next year, there'll be another episode covering Rare's later works.
But we went down the route of calling the game Dinosaur Planet, and I started building lots of different dinosaurs.
But we moved on to Banjo-Kazooie. Well, actually, we moved on to Project Dream, and then it became Banjo-Kazooie.
That's all from me though. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to let us know in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and follow me over on Twitter. Thanks for your patience, and until next time, stay retro.